Thank you. I think it will be for me difficult to sum up the plot, but anyway, it is a fusion of thriller, adventure, and love story. And the chapter I will read is actually set in Kazakh's desert, but the chapter explains everything. Jamshed, a short, lean Kazakh with eyes that were always smiling, lived in a nomad tent or yurt with his two daughters, Gulya and Natasha. Gulya was staggeringly beautiful with long legs and incredibly clear complexion, which was especially noticeable when she was standing beside Natasha, whose face had been cruelly affected by smallpox. They were both a head taller than their father. I was slowly recovering, lying on a heap of rags in the yurt and squinting at the bright sunlight coming in through a triangle where flap of material had been folded back. It was the second day I had been there, still feeling the woodiness in my muscles and joints. But this was the second day of consciousness. I didn't know yet how long I had been lying there before that. The owners of the yurt took care of me, but without speaking, as if they were afraid that it was dangerous for me to talk. I must say that I myself was by no means certain that I could speak. My tongue lay in my mouth like a heavy, immovable stone, and its bitter, sour immobility occasionally made me feel sick. I wanted really badly to rinse my mouth out with some kind of mouthwash. Gulya came in wearing a long green short dress and white trousers. She had a large cup in her hand. She leaned down over me and set the cup to my lips. I opened my mouth and a bitter milky liquid poured into it. Not exactly what I felt like just at the moment. But I drank it, especially since my lips had dried out and the tough of the cool earthenware of the cup proved more pleasant than the drink itself. Still without saying a word, Gulya moved away from me, rummaged in a cardboard box standing on the floor of the yurt and went out. I lay there alone for about half an hour, hearing the Kazakh language being spoken loudly and beautifully outside the yurt. Jamshed was arguing about something with his daughters. Then it went quiet. I fell asleep. I was woken by a sensation of coolness. Surprised, I opened my eyes and immediately looked at the yurt entrance. It was still light outside, but no longer sunny. I could hear the crackling of a campfire. Glimmers of light flickered just beyond the open flap. I raised myself up on my elbows. My body was heavy, but it was already beginning to obey me again. My arms, at least, were back completely, and I leaned on them to lift myself up, then lowered my feet onto the carpet and froze. I sat like that for about 10 minutes, and then stood up, staggering on legs that were not fully under control, and walked to the exit. I looked out. Jamshed was sitting by the fire, with a heap of dry feather grass and some kind of brushwood on his left. His daughters were sitting facing him with their backs to me, and there were two camels standing about 10 meters behind them, close to the tent. The camels were standing quite still, so that at first they seemed like a single camel with multiple humps, blocking off part of the evening horizon and the sky. But one of them suddenly shook its head, and my vision was immediately replaced by reality. Then the other camel took a step backwards and lowered its muzzle to the sand. "Oh, come over," Jamshed called to me. "If not for Hatema, you would have been done for." "Who's Hatema?" I asked, looking round at the girls whose names I already knew. Jamshed nodded towards the camels. Hatema noticed a piece of tarpaulin and went over and started pulling it. We shouted and shouted for her, then went over and saw too, so we got you out. Not everyone is that lucky. "Thank you," I said, and cast a glance at the camels, to one of which I owed my life. "Where were you going?" Jamshed asked. "Fort Shevchenko." "But why on foot?" I shrugged. "A traveler," I sighed. "I make a lousy traveler," I said with feeling after a long pause. "Why?" Jamshed objected. "You got here, so already you are a traveler, but why alone with no woman?" "I don't have a woman." Jamshed pondered on that, then turned and looked at his camels. "But why you want Fort Shevchenko?" he asked, looking at me again. The fire crackled, rapidly consuming more and more of the sprigs of uprooted brushwood that Jamshed fed to it without looking. And his daughters sat there quietly without moving, as if they weren't listening to the conversation. "I've come from Kiev," I began slowly, trying to answer without deceiving them, but also without revealing the purpose of my journey completely. "I wanted to take a look at the places where Shevchenko served." You Ukrainian? Jamshed asked in surprise. No, Russian, but I've lived in Kiev all my life. Jamshed nodded. It would be good for you to meet Akirbai, he said, nodding his head thoughtfully. Akirbai knows a lot about Akin Shevchenko. He was friends with his kinfolk. With what kinfolk? I asked in amazement. With his Kazakh kinfolk. With his great-great-great-grandson until he got lost in Karatau. There is nowhere to get lost there, but he went and disappeared. But he didn't have any sons or grandsons, I said rather sharply. Well, he couldn't marry, of course. Soldiers were not allowed to. But a Kazakh woman, a shepherd's daughter, had a son by him. The line continued after that, and all the men in it were good Akins. And the last one who disappeared in Karatau was a fine Akin too. A very good Akin he was. Back in Soviet times, he could retell any article from Pravda in verse as he read it. What an Akin he was. I have never heard another one like him before or since. Meanwhile, Jamshed's daughters went on sitting there as motionless and silent as sphinxes. And that made me feel awkward. Even the camels moved, snorting and making other sounds, but there wasn't a single sigh or a breath from Gula and Natasha. And I suddenly wanted very much to hear a woman's voice, especially since I had heard them talking to their father while I was lying in the yurt. Jamshed, I asked, casting aside my reserve, why don't they say anything? I nodded at the girls. The men are talking, Jamshed explained calmly. Then he smiled as if he had guessed what I wanted. He said something to his daughters in Kazakh. Natasha went into the yurt and came back with some kind of musical instrument that looked like a mandolin. And she started singing, plucking at the strings with her fingers. She sang in Kazakh. Her pretty voice was enchanting, melodic, as though designed to encourage you to sing alone. But although the melody was not complicated, I didn't even try to hum. And I suddenly noticed that while Natasha sang, Gula was watching me intently and very frankly. I felt myself melt under the gaze of her eyes, which seemed to glow in the brand new night that was lit only by the campfire and the deep blue sky. Frightened, I turned my eyes to Jamshed and saw the fixed smile in his eyes, only now that smile seemed to have come to life. But Natasha's song went on, and I had the idea that their attentive gazes were connected in some way with the words of this song that I couldn't understand. And surprisingly enough, I was quite right. This is a song about a traveler who is saved by a she-camel and brought to a house where two girls live, Jamshed told me when it was quite quiet again. I was stunned. At first I didn't know what to say, but then I asked, and what happens afterwards to the traveler in this song? The girl's father tells him to choose one of the girls in order to continue his journey with her. One of the daughters is beautiful, the other is not. One will never love him, the other will love him and remember him forever. But he chooses the one who will not love him and lives with her. And then, she did not finish the song, Jamshed said with a sigh. I turned my eyes to Natasha. She was sitting there in silence, having put her instrument down on the sand beside her. I looked at Gula and met her intent gaze again, and I immediately turned my eyes away, still perturbed by the words of the song. Do you have any water? I asked in order to distract myself from my thoughts. Jamshed looked at Gula. She went into the yurt and came back with a large cup in her hand. She held out the cup to me. I took a gulp. It was something like kefir again. Don't you drink pure water? We do, Jamshed replied, when there is nothing else. I stopped talking and finished the kefir, then put the cup down on the sand. I looked at Natasha. Excuse me, but do you know how the words of that song go on? I asked her. She looked at her father in fright, as if she expected him to help her. You know, she was making it up as she went along. She's an Akin too, but you must not tell anyone. Women are not supposed to be Akins. If they find out, no one will take her as a wife. And she did not finish it because every complete story ends badly. A good Akin never finishes even a well-known song with a bad ending. My mouth had gone dry again, and I asked for another drink. Gula went into the yurt again and refilled my cup. Which of my daughters do you like? Jamshed suddenly asked. I gaped at him, stunned, but he used his eyes to direct my gaze in the direction of the girls. Gula, I confessed. He nodded with an air as if he had known beforehand what my answer would be.